Welcome to Current Affairs. My name is Nathan Robinson. I am the editor-in-chief of Current Affairs magazine. I am joined today by Professor Sophia Rosenfeld. She is the Walter Annenberg Professor of History and the chair of the History Department at the University of Pennsylvania. She is the author of books including The Age of Choice, A History of Freedom in Modern Life, which was just published by the Princeton University Press. She's also the author of A Revolution in Language, The Problem of Science in Late 18th Century France, and the book that is most important in informing the conversation we're going to have today, which is Common Sense, a political history published by Harvard University Press in 2011. Professor Rosenfeld, thank you so much for joining us on Current Affairs today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me as a guest.
Well, you were the person I wanted to talk to because I heard President Trump in his inaugural address speak of a revolution of common sense is his term. And also, after there was the recent tragic plane crash over the Potomac in January, he gave a press conference. He claimed that diversity policies were responsible for the crash. It was still under investigation. No one knew what was responsible for the crash. And he was asked, how he could possibly conclude this. And he replied, "Because I have common sense." So I thought, well, you know who I need to talk to? I need to talk to the world's leading historian of the concept of common sense, which is a very interesting niche for you to occupy. But I wondered if first I could get your reaction to hearing the President of the United States put so much emphasis in his rhetoric on a term that over 10 years ago now, you have explored the political meanings of.
Well, yes, we are a small number of people, the experts on common sense out there. Yeah. It's not exactly a huge field. So I'm happy to be described as a world leading authority in the area. And actually, common sense and its evocation in political life is hardly new with President Trump. This is a storyline in American politics that goes all the way back to Tom Paine, and we can talk about its various manifestations since then. And Trump used common sense here and there already in the first term. So it isn't entirely a new term for him, but he's been talking about it a lot in recent days. And so have a lot of his acolytes. It's been repeated all over the place on Fox News and elsewhere. And so I wasn't surprised, but I am interested that the more radical his ideas become in recent days, the more extreme anything he pronounces is, the more likely he is to tell us that it's common sense. And there are a lot of reasons for that, but I'll start with that. Just simply that, there's an evoking common sense as your crutch and actually espousing common sense have never really gone together.
That's fascinating because I think one's intuition, perhaps, one's associations with the term might be that, common sense is the term that we use to describe that which is essentially inarguable, those things that nearly everyone accepts to be true and accepts to be true because they're very hard to dispute. There's some kind of body of factual knowledge and values that we can all sort of roughly agree on. These things are common sense. You're describing a political use of the term, however, which seems to take things that are highly contentious and try to brand them as being part of that body of undisputable, inarguable truths.
That is exactly right. I mean, notice that the first thing you evoked was the expression, a revolution of common sense. Revolutions, by definition, upset norms on all fronts. Common sense is, in some sense, the antithesis. Common sense is the thing we all already agree on that we barely need to talk about because it's all so obvious. You put your hand in the fire, you're going to get burned. You don't need to explain that to most people because that seems like something that experientially all of us just simply know. And yet a revolution of common sense. Well, that's in some ways what Tom Paine in 1776 said he was inaugurating. And what he meant by that was not so much that the existing common sense was in favor of what he's saying, but that common sense itself could be invoked if we thought about it the right way to justify what was actually a revolution, a vast change in thinking, the reversal of the idea that the colonies belonged to a mother country, and the reversal of the idea that it was obvious that people needed to be ruled by a king and an aristocracy. What's interesting about Trump is that he's using this language, but in some sense in reverse, to argue for himself as something like a king and to reintroduce ideas of colonialism. I mean, much of this is a kind of reversal. Invoking common sense does suggest we all already believe this, but it also suggests the possibility that with time, we will all come to see this as the general wisdom.
Now, so what you're raising there is a very interesting kind of paradox of the way that common sense is used in political discourse, which is about things that are in fact extremely contentious. And obviously people's main association with the term common sense might be that the Tom Paine's pamphlet that was so instrumental in catalyzing the American Revolution. And you draw our attention to an interesting feature of that, which is that it is there is a kind of attempt. I don't want to call it dishonest, but it is a piece of rhetoric that suggests that we all ought to believe something by suggesting that we all on some level already do believe it, even though technically we don't already all believe it, because the American Revolution at the time, Thomas Paine is writing Common Sense. The position that he is espousing is not a consensus position of Americans.
Absolutely correct. That is well put, and you're absolutely right. It's a rhetorical kind of sleight of hand. But there's a second dimension of what it does, too, and this is why populists, in particular, from Paine onwards, Ronald Reagan talked about common sense a lot, too. Trump is evoking also a populist rhetoric in talking about common sense for two reasons. One, common sense is opposed to the knowledge that's derived from expertise, from knowledge that's derived from elites, that's knowledge that's derived from anything except the kind of kitchen table logic of ordinary people. And that's been a theme for Trump all along. When he talks about common sense, he says, I'm not book smart. I don't have the big vocabulary to talk about this. I just know things when I see them. I just have instinct. I have, a kind of a touch that tells me what's true. So there's part of this is invoking also in his revolution of common sense. He's also suggesting that he isn't going to the usual sources for the kinds of opinions presidents come up with. He's going to this kind of everyday, every man shared platform. The second thing that common sense suggests, it's a kind of anti-pluralist position too. It doesn't say, here's one position one might take. It says it's the only position. Common sense is what all real people would believe. If you thought something different, what's the opposite of common sense? Nonsense.
Yeah.
Kind of, it's the realm of impossible, arcane, weird, strange, not worth taking seriously opinion. So it's a clever term for him because it lets him suggest something radical, but put it in terms that really kind of go very well with his efforts to make himself into something of a at least rhetorical populist. Whether his policies are populist is a different matter.
One of the interesting things about what you're saying there is that common sense is used in a way that suggests the concept is democratic, that it is an appeal to, what all of us think and believe. But in fact, it can be quite exclusionary in the way that it's used, in that if I take things I believe that are actually quite ideological, actually quite contentious, and I brand them as common sense, what I am essentially doing, as you indicate, is I am saying that if you are not on board with me, you are outside the realm of reason itself. I don't need to debate with you. You've lost the plot. You are not in the community of people who even have the basic ability to perceive the world, which is quite an exclusionary claim if the thing that you are branding as common sense is a highly contentious claim like DEI causes plane crashes.
Right. And it's a conversation stopper, right? If you said, God, that's just common sense. You aren't saying, let's keep talking about this because I see things differently than you. You're saying there's kind of no other possible idea out there. Nothing else is really going to hold up. So there's definitely a sense in which it can be exclusionary. What's I think really interesting, though, is when people are on the outside politically, evoking common sense can be a way in. It's a way to say, okay, maybe I don't have all the sophistication you do. Maybe I don't have all the right language, but I've lived in the world and I know various things. And sometimes it's actually can be a useful democratic tool. And it has been for groups that have been marginal who can marshal it to say, you know, I don't have to be, say, an economist myself to know how to save money or something like that, you know, kind of. But if you're inside and you evoke it from the center, it's an exclusionary tool because it's saying that only the real people who really are with me know what's what.
Well, I mean, I couldn't help but think, as you say there, about what a brilliant kind of masterstroke it is by Thomas Paine to use common sense as the framing for his argument. I mean, the pamphlet is famously probably the single most influential piece of writing in the history of, outside of maybe the Communist Manifesto, the Bible, really up there in terms of pieces of writing that changed the world or in terms of its cascading kind of effects. And you think, well, why? And one of the reasons is it's so brilliant to say, as you say, well, if you were thinking straight, you would be with me. And we're not, we may be on the outside. We may not be the consensus, but pure logic and reason of the simplest kind lead inexorably toward the position that I am about to espouse for you.
Absolutely. And it's full of rhetorical sleights of hand like that. He says things like, Britain's a small place. The colonies are really big. Why should a small thing rule a bigger thing? And on the face of it, logically, of course, that's pretty clever. It's a little like Trump saying, well, I don't know who the pilot was, but, well, it kind of makes sense if you somehow diluted the pool of talent. That must have been the cause. I mean, it has this kind of, it isn't a perfect analogy there, but it's a suggestion of things that don't quite necessarily make sense, but they make sense at some very instinctive level. They're not really fact driven, but they're driven by some kind of logic or habit of mind, and that they can sound sensible, even if they might not be. I mean, since when does it matter what size one thing ruling another is? That's not a premise in politics, but put that way, it sounds like a logical dictate.
Well, and Reagan would say things like, well, it's just common sense that if you tax something, you get less of it, or if you need to be strong in order to negotiate peace. And when you actually analyze these things, so you take them more as, common sense is something that's kind of revealed immediately. Like you don't need to do much analysis in order to find out whether it's true. It comes to you all of a sudden, and that's it. It's kind of settled. I recently heard a clip of Robert F. Kennedy, who was, I don't think he used the term common sense, but he was using that kind of rhetoric to talk about measles vaccines, and he was like, well, my family, we had 11 siblings. We all got the measles. We were fine.
Everybody got measles. And measles gave you lifetime protection against measles infection. The vaccine doesn't do that.
And it's like, well, okay, so that's all you need. You just need the common experience of your family was fine. And so you don't need to look at any studies of childhood mortality from measles. It becomes irrelevant because your experience has already gotten you to the inarguable truth.
That couldn't be a better example, because that is exactly how common sense logic works. And one thing that's pretty clear is that in a lot of the sciences, from economics to biology, common sense isn't really the way things necessarily work. I mean, vaccines, for instance, give you some of the disease in order for you to not get it later. Deficit spending is not how a family manages its budget, that kind of thing. And we do rely to a considerable degree on experts in all of these realms, because we certainly can't know the answers to all these questions. And experts are often wrong. So it's easy to find examples of expert knowledge gone bad. But we often do turn to experts to help us through all kinds of crises, especially in governments. Families operate on slightly different principles. But if you operate on the principle that whatever's happened to me is kind of generalizable, if I had a cold winter where I live, there is no global warming, or I didn't get sick and I didn't get the vaccine, that might give you a kind of common sense knowledge of things. And it's certainly worth experts listening to that. I mean, experts should not turn away from people's experience in the world, but taken by itself, common sense can be highly misleading. It can produce just the kinds of examples you just gave.
Hi, sorry to interrupt, but if you like this video, please subscribe to this channel for more wonderful current affairs material in the future, and head to currentaffairs.org/subscribe to subscribe to our beautiful print magazine today. Last week on the program, we spoke to the physicist, Sean Carroll, and one of the things we talked about was how the history of the development of the physical sciences is in some ways a history of all of our common sense understandings of how the world works being progressively overthrown. The deeper we look at the universe, the more we find that it is totally bizarre and strange, and that things that you think are absolutely true via your common sense, such as, for example, there is a thing that it is what time it is. Time is absolute, right? The time just progresses. It's one thing. There's a clock for the universe, and it ticks along. Well, it turns out that's not true at all. Time is relative, and it's a different time. And there are crazy facts about the universe that we find. And in many ways, the development of expertise has come from taking these things that appear totally obvious and challenging them and finding out that the world is deeply strange, and that truth and common sense, radically depart from one another.
That's exactly right. And the book that I actually wrote after the book about common sense, which was written in a different political moment, but I think is proved to be sort of ever more relevant as common sense has increasingly been a populist theme in the last 15 years, was a book called Democracy and Truth, A Short History. And that was written during the first Trump administration, precisely because I was struck by this growing tension and kind of bifurcation between, on the one hand, knowledge derived from expertise, which seemed to be moving sort of farther and farther away from ordinary people, technocratic government, you might say. And on the other hand, a different kind of politics growing from an attachment to common sense, but also instinct, faith, a variety of sources of knowledge that seemed kind of to be moving in the opposite direction from expertise. And to me, that knowledge split, which some people have called kind of epistemological tribalism in recent years, is at the source of the sort of growing tension in our politics between technocrats on the one side and populists on the other. And to me, the ideal obviously has to lie somewhere between those two, a kind of a government that's rooted in expertise, but that has democratic buy-in and ordinary people's participation in it as well. But the two strands have moved farther and farther from each other, to the degree that experts often, sort of seem to be ignoring the experience of, say, farmers when they're creating policies around climate, say. And on the other hand, you have a kind of populism that is in its most extreme in the current weeks is somebody like Kennedy Jr., who simply doesn't think that science has much to offer to explain how, how we're going to be healthy and safe in this brave new world.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly have found myself making the kinds of arguments that say, all right, well, these economic statistics reveal one picture about the economy, but people's experience, you have to understand people's experience, and you need policies that respond to people's experiences, and their experiences are not wrong, and there may be things that are overlooked by scientists, and in fact, the data. I've made this argument about medicine and doctors that ignore patient reports of their own subjectivity, and why subjectivity is actually an important piece of data, and experts can't be the specific. But then at the end of as I say, the other end of the spectrum, you have this kind of like, nothing said by an expert can be trusted because they're an expert. Right?
Yeah, that's the kind of reductio absurdum position, right? Which is when you get to the degree that if somebody said it who, is part of any government agency or at any major research university or any major hospital system, it can't be trusted because they obviously have some kind of bias in. And it's a disaster for us if we start thinking that expert opinion in every realm is kind of actually just a partisan political position. I mean, we want apolitical doctors and say, back to air accidents, air traffic controllers. We just want people who know their business.
Well, the terrifying thing is that it sort of could lead you towards believing that the more people know about something, the less they are to be trusted.
Yes.
You kind of have the opposite of a system where people who know what they're doing are put in charge of a thing. I think probably our listeners will want to know one of the basic questions that I'm sure you've answered many times, which is, where did this term come from? It didn't originate with Tom Paine. Where did he get it from? What are the origins of the concept of common sense?
Absolutely important to think about, where does this come from? It's actually an ancient term, but it doesn't really become a term in politics until sort of the very beginning of the 18th century. And in English politics first, and it proves to be a good political weapon just as a kind of partisan politics is emerging. So you'd think, it must have been a kind of long-standing category. There are earlier understandings of popular opinion, but the term common sense enters politics in England in the early 18th century just as parties are getting underway. And it is a rhetorical political weapon from the beginning. I think that it's hard to even imagine democracy getting off the ground later in the 18th century without this term, because it does suggest two important things. One, that ordinary people have a capacity, even if they're not extremely literate and extremely learned, to engage in politics at all. And the other is that politics itself is easy enough to understand that you don't need some kind of arcane knowledge to be able to understand its principles. It doesn't have to be some kind of mysterious science only the initiated can know about. And I see that as a kind of important development. So by the time Tom Paine is using the term, it's a clever use of it. For sure, it's an innovative use, but the term has already been circulating in politics for some time. He just makes the most spectacular use of it. And at first, it really is a tool of democracy. But what I think happens over time is that it is often a tool of a kind of populism that can undermine democracy as much as support it. And that's the kind of shift that I see happening. It becomes a term that both Democrats and Republicans used through the 20th century, but in recent decades, it's been largely a tool of the right, because it's the right that has attached itself to a kind of populist politics, whereas in other times and places, sometimes the left has done so, in the US at least.
I sense a certain ambivalence that you might have about the term common sense. On the one hand, important in establishing that people's own opinions about political questions are valuable, that we care about them, that everyone everyone has something valuable to contribute. On the other hand, as we've discussed, can very easily become a propaganda term.
That's exactly right. And your example about the economy was, I think, a really good one. We heard a lot in the build-up to the election that Biden's economic numbers, as reported by economists, were really good, right? Inflation was lower than most of the world. Unemployment was at record lows. There were lots of good indicators out there. But we also heard a lot from people who went to the supermarket, and we always seem to be talking about the price of eggs, and even more so in recent weeks. But ordinary people found themselves wondering why their grocery bills were higher. And it led to a kind of insecurity, which is we shouldn't dismiss out of hand. It's important to recognize that ordinary people going to the grocery store and having a little bit of sticker shock is an important economic indicator too. And our politics has to kind of find, so I'm not unsympathetic at all to the idea that expert opinion alone is not helpful, isolated in a democratic environment. But there has to be some kind of rapprochement between those, kind of a meeting place between those two kinds of indicators where we can think, what does it mean to say, I'm finding my groceries really expensive and unemployment rates are at an all-time low?
Over the course of American political history, has everyone kind of presented their own point of view as just being common sense? And presumably during the debates over slavery, people who supported slavery think that it's just common sense that there's a natural racial hierarchy and that some people are destined to be on the bottom and some people are destined to be on the top. And the opponents of slavery think, well, it's completely obvious, it's basic common sense that if you believe in the principles of the Declaration of Independence, that slavery is completely inconsistent with basic morality, and it's interesting. I'm sure there have been sort of competing appeals to common sense.
There have been competing appeals, and even the content of what counts as common sense. It sounds ahistorical, right? Like my example of you put your hand in the fire and it burns you. It really shouldn't matter where you are in the world and in what century. That's going to pretty much hold true. But lots of what we take to be common sense actually turns out to be very culturally and historically specific. So your example of slavery is an excellent one. Is the world organized in hierarchical ways? To most people in most places and times, that's been completely obvious that there are hierarchies within the world in any direction that you look. Organizations are hierarchical. The chain between heaven and earth is hierarchical, even animals, right? But we've taken to be commonsensical that a certain kind of basic equality also exists between humans, which is a rather radical idea, as Tom Paine, among others, pointed out. So Trump's suggestion that what he's proposing is nothing but common sense is, in a sense, an effort to push history in a particular direction. It's to say, yes, this is rooted a little bit in what you already know because you're my ordinary people who are backing me. But it's also to say we all need to get on board with a view of the world in which, for instance, it's common sense that the Gulf of Mexico should be the Gulf of America, or Greenland should be an American property, even though this hasn't been our common sense at all. In fact, the very principles, like taking over another piece of another part of the world, have become increasingly frowned upon and are not part of our common sense in recent decades. He likes to shock by putting a crown on himself in an image to call himself a king. That's something no president has ever done. So in fact, it violates American common sense. But there's a kind of poking at our norms that is accompanied all the time with the suggestion this is what really ordinary people do want and think.
What's a little alarming in some sense, although encouraging in another, is that if the concept of common sense is malleable, it means that maybe you could establish a new norm. You say that Trump is violating the American common sense norm of opposition to monarchy, but as we've seen, you stake out your position for the new common sense, and you can in fact create a new common sense. And it occurred to me as you were speaking, I wonder if all successful social movements have, in some sense, conducted the rhetorical sleight of hand where you declare that the world, or you declare that things are a certain way because you want them to be a certain way, and you hope that by declaring that that's the way that they in fact are, you can move other people to agree with you. That Marx declares that capitalism is destined to destroy itself, but in a sense he hopes that by doing so he is going to encourage a lot of other people to believe that that's the way, and then bring about the outcome.
You're outlining exactly the kind of theories of an Italian Marxist of the early 20th century, Gramsci, who said basically what you've just said, that for any social movement to work, anything with a popular basis, it has to tap in a certain way to some part of existing common sense and then turn it in a new direction. So Marx, for instance, had to tap into worker discontent, a sense that things were unjust, in order to then put forward and encourage an idea that was extremely radical in its moment. So it does suggest to us that, and this has been a Republican tool more than a Democratic one, though the Democrats have come up with things like common sense gun laws. And again, a place where we're fighting all the time, but the suggestion is this would be the common sense. Sometimes they mean, could this be the place we could find agreement? Sometimes they believe they're simply suggesting the introduction of a new version. But I do think a successful social movement has to, in some way, tap into ways people are already experiencing the world a little bit, and then take that experience and move it a little bit in the direction that we want to go. Calling it common sense does always have the potential to be a little demagogic because it doesn't suggest the possibility of opposition, as I suggested before. But there's something to this idea that if you just announce a radical idea, people will dismiss it out of hand as just sort of too crazy and weird to be toyed with.
So, in a sense, it may be difficult to escape from making these kinds of appeals to things that people already think. But I think one of the values of your book is that at least let us interrogate what our implicit assumptions about this concept are. Are we saying that the consensus position of ordinary people should be deferred to because it is the consensus position? Are we saying, do we believe that it can be wrong sometimes? If so, what do we believe? We have to do some thinking about the degree to which we should accept. I mean, I think we should even do it with Tom Paine. Does the argument hold up? Is it valid? To interrogate it and to recognize the ways in which this can be wielded strategically as a propaganda term to subvert the kind of inquiry that we might otherwise be inclined to do to examine whether an idea holds up.
So true. So in that sense, I'm an odd kind of historian because the things that interest me in general are the kinds of things that seem so obvious and that we basically don't talk about them, much less question them. And the things that interest me are those kinds of pillars of democracy, which get thrown around a lot without much investigation. And I thought common sense was one of them. It sounds obvious what it is. It's obvious because it's common sense. It's almost like a circle. But in fact, it turns out to be a political weapon, and it's important both in the construction of democracy and in the undermining of democracy. And my current work on choice.
Well, I was just going to say, and then the new book, right, takes another concept, right, that we just invoke all the time, which is choice.
Yeah, so I'm always interested in these categories. So they sound like weird things for a historian to investigate. And in fact, as you said before, there aren't a lot of experts out there on common sense because it's supposed to not need experts, right? But in the case of choice, it struck me again, it's a kind of politic idea that crosses the right-left divide largely. Most people fight about what we should be choosing, but not about the value of choice itself, from reproductive choice to school choice. And it has an interesting way in which it's both a kind of support for our political system. Democracy is rooted in choice. Human rights is rooted in choice, but so is consumer culture and capitalism these days. And it's almost the meeting point for the two, are the ideas that choosing gets you what you want in life, and choosing ultimately makes you free. When you're a chooser, you're an autonomous, independent person. And this seems maybe very obvious to us, but to my mind, it really shouldn't be seen as obvious. It's historically specific. It's unusual. It doesn't develop till quite late in our history. It's not global, although it increasingly is, just because of American and Western European influence on the world. And again, my goal is really just to get people to kind of think about it again, to sort of see the ways in which it shapes our politics, even if it seems like something not really worth paying attention to.
Well, friend of the magazine, Professor Noam Chomsky, often says that the beginning of science is the willingness to be puzzled by that which seems obvious. And I, as I was thinking about a choice, I was thinking, when you and start being exposed to your critical analysis of the idea, interrogation of the idea. I thought, well, my first instinct is, but what could possibly be wrong with choice? And then I started to think, and I remembered that, again, to go back to the subject of vaccines, the anti-vaccine movement framed itself as a movement of choice. And I wrote an article a while back going, well, hang on a minute. There are more values here than choice. And one value is not making choices that cause other people to die. So if your choice results in the spread of a deadly illness through society, then in fact, we need to restrict your choice. Like, I understand that choice sounds like something that trumps everything. Well, shouldn't I have a choice as to what to put in my body? And it's like, well, perhaps you shouldn't have a choice that allows you to choose the deaths of other people.
Yeah, so Trump's first executive orders, some of them had a lot of language about choice in them. And you think, well, that's kind of a liberal value, isn't it? People choosing things. And he uses even the expression freedom of choice. And what does he want choice in? Choice in automobiles, choice in appliances, and choice in light bulbs was in one of the first ones. And you think, well, how do I reconcile that with this kind of authoritarian strain? But the choice itself precisely is to say, well, energy consumption be damned, right? Or kind of, it takes away a larger value, maybe our climate change, say, in favor of the idea that, hey, everybody gets what they want. And that's really the same kind of logic you're talking about when people say my body, my choice, and they mean I don't have to wear a mask or I want to resist a vaccine mandate. It means I get to pick what I want. But as you say, it doesn't really matter what happens to other people or the greater good in some way. So choice is sometimes, again, I'm not arguing that choice is always bad. That hardly.
Right.
But I do think it's a case in which we might not want to jump to the conclusion that more options or more opportunities for choice always get us somewhere better.
Well, and if we're not able to make informed choices, our choices may make us worse off. So, one of the criticisms that I make of the school choice quote unquote movement is that if you have private for-profit schools, they will trick parents into making bad choices, and extract money out of the system, and then people might face a very limited range of choices, and you have choice, but who decides the range of choices that you have? Who gives you the information that and sorting through information can be a very, very time-consuming process. Lots of people can't do it, so they can't make good choices, even though you've given them choices. That's
right. So sometimes it's a matter of the fact that we're all told we have free choice, but of course some of us have much greater access to good choices and to good information than do others. And that includes, of course, financial access, not just, but every sort of access point. So we're all sort of held responsible for our choices, even though we have very differential relations to them. But there are some choices that even people with all the resources around might not want. For instance, would you rather have one good health plan, or would you rather your employer give you a choice of 9? And this one has a deductible at this percent for hospitalization, and this one has a copay that's higher. But that, and you start thinking, well, I don't know what's going to happen to me.
Right.
I don't know what's going to happen to my family. How am I supposed to decide if I'm better off paying a higher premium now because of a disaster later? In this case, it doesn't seem to me that choice is liberating. In fact, it's a kind of puzzle that's unsolvable.
Yes. No, I wrote an article a while back about the Obamacare marketplace and how it was literally impossible to make a rational choice because the amount of information that was given to you, you just couldn't, you had to make a kind of arbitrary choice because there were so many different plans. So it had to be arbitrary. But choice, of course, once you've made a choice, that can be used to shift responsibility to you as well.
Right. So you chose that health insurance plan and you didn't know you were going to get hit by a truck, but you made the choice. So
you made the choice.
You better live.
So,
you live with the consequences that you picked the plan without the full hospitalization or something like that.
So lots of problems, here. There's the problem of shifting the consequences, like with global warming and how the global south suffers the consequences of consumer choices made in the United States. There's the fact that you can't make good choices, that choice can be used to shift responsibility. This is fascinating. People should pick up your new book. I want to return as we close here to this idea of common sense. I did want to touch on the fact that there are some people who have rejected. One of the things about common sense is that even if we might disagree about the content of common sense, for the most part, we all agree that there is such a thing. And there are occasional people like the Dadaists who have said, to hell with that, we reject the very idea of common sense.
If you really want to be a contrarian, in aesthetic terms, in any other kinds of terms, one way to do that is simply say there's no such thing, or if it does exist, it is a form of nonsense. And that has been a position that philosophers and artists at various moments have taken, and they've often taken it in response to what they see as kind of abuses of common sense to support horrible things like wars. The Dadaists were responding to the First World War and saying, there's nothing sensible about any of this. How could people have destroyed each other over nothing like this? And that is in a sense, that can be a sensible position to be opposed to sensibleness. In their case, especially, they produced a lot of great art. I think in our politics, though, we do need some kind of appeal to some shared values. I mean, a democracy can't, to my mind, fully work unless there's some kind of very low level acceptance of a few basic ideas. And they're not very extensive, but certain sense that rules matter, that that facts matter, that certain kinds of these sound very, very basic. But I do think that some of those certain things are good or bad, some very basic moral ideas are kind of essential to the operation of a shared culture. And that includes a little bit of also a sense of some solidarity with others, that you don't have to love everyone else, but you have to feel that it matters a little bit, say in that plane crash that people died. If you shrug, you can't really believe in a democratic norm. So I guess my end point is really just to say that we do need a shared realm, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be a little skeptical the next time somebody invokes common sense to justify whatever the hell they've just proposed.
Yes, because there's one possible path you could take where you say, like the Dadaists, you say, well, if this is reason, I choose madness. But one could come out as sort of total, one conclusion that someone might get after reading a history like yours about common sense as well. They might take a totally relativist position, which is to say, well, all invocations of reason are propaganda. And so what could we possibly believe? But what you've outlined there to us is a kind of approach where we don't reject the concept of common sense, but we are on guard for political uses. We understand that we can be manipulated through the use of terminology that is designed to make it seem as if things that are highly contentious are in fact obvious and indisputable.
Exactly.
So, well, I'm so glad we got to speak about this, because you, as I say, you are the one person I really wanted to turn to for this discussion, because you have written this brilliant history of the political uses of common sense. Is common sense a political history? And even though it came out in 2011, it's still so relevant and powerful. So I hope people pick up your old book, and I hope they pick up your new book, so that they can also interrogate this other idea that they're going to hear all the time, which is choice. So thank you, Professor Rosenfeld, so much for joining us on Current Affairs today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Thanks for watching. This video is a product of Current Affairs magazine, the country's leading independent left print magazine based here in New Orleans, Louisiana. Go to currentaffairs.org to find out more about us, and currentaffairs.org/subscribe to subscribe to our absolutely gorgeous bi-monthly print edition. Get it in your mailbox. You can also subscribe to the Current Affairs News Briefing, the Current Affairs podcast, or you can subscribe to our digital edition. Current Affairs is entirely reader-supported. We have no ads. We have no corporate backers. We depend on you. So please consider purchasing a subscription or making a donation to Current Affairs today. We are a 501c3 non-profit organization, and your donations are tax-deductible to the extent allowable by law. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching.